Hi, this lecture continues our look at Nyaya arguments for the existence of the self, and this lecture will focus specifically on the enduring self. Recall that the Nyaya philosopher wants to show that the self exists by means of inference. So it begins by stipulating that we have certain experiences, that we have certain data, and we can infer the existence of the self from that data because a self is needed to explain that data. So the data consists in experiences such as pain, pleasure, and so on, and there needs to be a self to have that pain and pleasure. In this lecture, we're focusing on the argument that there needs to be an enduring self, a self that persists through time. Now, the Buddhists would reject the existence of an enduring self because the Buddhist holds that there's really only persons that are bundles of psychological properties, and those psychological properties continually change from one moment to the next. So you don't have a numerically identical entity called the self at one moment and at the next. Rather, what you have is just a constantly changing series of experiences. The Nyaya philosopher wants to hold that there needs to be something underlying these experiences, and that it needs to always be the same thing underlying those experiences. So the previous lecture focused on how there needs to be an underlying entity to have experiences, such as pleasure, pain, and desire. This lecture focuses on how there needs to be the same entity underlying those experiences from one moment to the next. We focus here on an argument given by Uddatakara. So he argues, quote, recognition could not occur if there were a plurality of subjects, a plurality of cognitively fixed contents, and a plurality of causes for the ideas put together. The ideative flows of sights, tastes, smells, and touches are not made to come together to form a recognition on their own, end quote. So notice that Uddatakara says that plurality of subjects would not explain a certain phenomenon, and we're narrowing our focus to a specific phenomenon, not just desire, not just pain, not just pleasure, but rather the recognition of objects given in our experience. Uddatakara's point is that this type of recognition is not possible unless there's one fixed self from one moment to the next, so that the self needs to be identical across time. This means that there's not merely just one subject that listened to the lectures on Buddhism last week, and that you listening to this lecture now are a different entity from the one that listened to the lectures on Buddhism last week. Rather, you are the same being, the same self that listened to the lectures on Buddhism last week. Let's see how we can formalize this argument given by Uddatakara. The argument begins by pointing out a phenomenon that the Buddhists themselves must acknowledge. This phenomenon is the recognition of objects. And what Uddatakara means by recognition here is a multifaceted experience. It includes memory of perceiving objects in the past, then the perception of an object in front of you, and then finally a consciousness that the current object that you're perceiving is identical to or the same as the object that you saw in the past. For example, when I see my pet cat Sylvie, I recognize her as Sylvie. It's not as though every time I see her, I have this completely new experience and I think, oh, that's a new cat. Oh, that's another cat. That's another cat. Rather, I recognize Sylvie as being the same cat from one day to the next. And I do this by having in my memory some awareness of her various features or qualities. And I also have that immediate direct perception at any given moment that I'm seeing those same qualities. The same colored fur, the same shape of the head, and all the other features that are uniquely identifiable in Sylvie. The next point in the argument is that this recognition wouldn't be possible if there were not something that exists that could unify the three things that are involved in recognition. You need one thing to unify or bring together the past memory, the current perception, and the awareness or consciousness that there's something similar between the past memory and the current perception. Uta Takar's next point is that memory, perception, and consciousness cannot unify themselves. Rather, you need a subject, some being, that brings those three things together. There needs to be something underlying the three, that is, a substance. But in this case, since there's a past memory and a current perception, that substance must endure in time. And thus we establish our conclusion that there's an enduring self, a substance that exists from one moment to the next and is numerically identical from one moment to the next. Let's look now at how the Buddhist philosopher might respond to this argument. The main thing that the Buddhist philosopher would say is that a self being enduring does not suffice for a self to be permanent. This point stems from the whole reason that the Buddhist philosopher is concerned with the self in the first place. We're concerned with the self because we're thinking about karma and the cycle of rebirth, and we're thinking about an entity that would exist throughout that same cycle and be a permanent entity. Now, merely proving that there's something that is enduring from one moment in time to the next doesn't show that such an entity is eternal, that's going to permanently exist. Still, the Nyaya philosopher can say that the Buddhist denial of a permanent self overlooks something, that it goes to an extreme view, and that we need not go to such an extreme view. The Buddhist philosopher seems to say either you have a self that is permanent or you don't have a self at all. And the Nyaya philosopher is basically pointing out, well, you have something in the middle. You have an enduring self. Now you might ask, doesn't the Buddhist philosopher have this sort of thing by positing the existence of persons rather than selves? But recall that persons for the Buddhist philosopher are merely bundles of psychological properties. This is different from the type of self posited by the Nyaya philosopher. The type of self posited by the Nyaya philosopher is a thing underlying those various psychological properties. This leads to the second objection that might be raised by the Buddhist philosopher. The Buddhist philosopher might say, there's no need to posit this underlying thing, because the various skandhas, the various aggregates or heaps of psychological properties and qualities like desire, hunger, thirst, what have you, those things might unify themselves, or they might take turns unifying the various qualities and states. Recall that one of the five skandhas is consciousness. So consciousness might be a skandha, might be a psychological property that unifies the other psychological properties, but it does so not by being a thing underlying the various psychological properties, but rather by being an act or process that changes from one moment to the next. I hope you see here how each side has considerations in their favor and has different moves that they can make in response to the other side. One move that the Nyaya school can make is by focusing on the fact that we have different sense modalities, that we experience some things through sight, some things through hearing, and so on, and we somehow coordinate between all these senses to give us a unified experience. And this is important because the Nyaya philosopher can say this gives us reason to posit something underlying the various psychological qualities or mental states, that there needs to be a thing that endures beneath them. So now let us look at Gautama's argument based on this point. Gautama says the following, quote, "Because one grasps the same object through sight and touch, there is a self that is distinct from the body and sense organs. Notice what he says there is that we have different senses and that there needs to be something distinct from those senses to unify them. And that object is distinct both from the individual sense organs, that is to say, distinct from both eyes and the skin that touches, but it's also distinct from body in general. It's something that is a psychological substance rather than a material substance, as we saw in the previous lecture. Now, Gautama recognizes that this point might be disputed, so he raises an objection to his own view. The objection is, quote, "This is wrong. There is no self that is distinct from the body and sense organs because sense organs are restricted to their own proper content." Now, the idea here is that sight only gets objects of sight. Touch only gets objects of touch. And they run in parallel, but they don't really intermingle. So that if you're aware of an object through touch but not by sight, you can't use your sight to get any sort of extra knowledge about the object known through touch. It doesn't inform sight in any way. Gautama responds to this point by saying, quote, "The very restriction of sense organs to their own proper content is a reason to suppose the existence of a self." Gautama's point here is that the objection that we just saw presupposes the existence of a self, and it undermines itself. This is because the objection takes a certain standpoint, a standpoint detached from the two different sense organs mentioned. It takes a standpoint that's detached from sight and detached from touch, and says, from this standpoint, oh, those objects that I see, those objects that I touch, those are different sets of objects. For example, that I can't touch colors that I have only through sight. But notice that this is the phenomenon of recognition, basically. From this standpoint that is independent of touch and sight, one judges that the two different things, sight and touch, are different. But what that amounts to is a way of unifying the data of touch and sight and comparing them to be sure to point out a difference between the two. Nevertheless, they're brought together in the performance of that comparison. Once again, let us reconstruct the argument. The first premise points out some basic data. The data being that we have an experience of objects through different sense organs like touch and sight. The second premise is that there needs to be something to unify or coordinate the different kinds of sensory data. There needs to be something that coordinates or puts into comparison what you have from sight and what you have from touch. But no individual sense organs can do that unification, can do that coordination between different sense modalities. Therefore, there must be some further thing to perform that act of unification. And this further thing is a self that underlies the various sense organs, and likewise underlies the various qualities, the various mental states that pertain to each of the sense modalities. I leave it as an exercise for the listener to evaluate this argument from the Buddhist perspective. In the next lecture, we'll look at the next and final argument from the Nyaya school that holds that there must be a self that determines itself.